At exactly 3 p.m. local time, the Caribbean seemed almost too peaceful. The water stretched out smooth beneath the bright afternoon sun, the trade winds were steady, and visibility was flawless. To most ships passing through the region, it would have felt like an ordinary day at sea. But for the sailors on watch, that calm surface was beginning to tell a different story. On the radar displays, distant surface contacts started to form a pattern. At first, they looked routine. Then their movement changed. Courses shifted, speeds increased. Bearings began drawing together, not by chance, but with clear purpose. One after another, several Venezuelan vessels adjusted their headings, turning toward the projected route of an American carrier group moving through international waters. On the bridge, no one panicked, no voices rose. The response was controlled, professional, and focused. The report was simple: contacts maneuvering with intent. A carrier group never moves through the ocean unaware. Every mile around it is watched, measured, and recorded. Radar teams followed each change in speed down to the knot. Operations crews recalculated the closest point of approach in real time. What the Venezuelan vessels were doing was careful but unmistakable. They were trying to position themselves in the way. That kind of maneuver does not happen by accident. At sea, small course changes can be explained as navigation, but a steady intercept path is different. Minute by minute, the picture became clearer. The Venezuelan ships were no longer simply observing from a distance. They were testing the boundary, measuring how close they could come, how much pressure they could create, and how the US Navy would answer. The American formation stayed steady. The carrier held its course. Its escorts remained in place, spread outward like a moving protective shield. There were no sharp turns, no sudden bursts of speed, and no dramatic gestures. The message was quiet but unmistakable. We see you. Inside the operations center, the posture shifted from routine monitoring to full documentation. Every signal from the approaching vessels was captured. Every movement was time-stamped. Optical sensors focused in, sending high-resolution imagery to analysts who needed facts, not assumptions. The priority was not to respond quickly. It was to respond correctly. Moves like this are rarely about starting a direct clash. More often, they are about creating tension, forcing a reaction, and shaping a story afterward. Make the carrier alter course. Make the US formation respond visibly. Create a moment that can later be presented as resistance or success. But a carrier group is not a single ship that can simply be pushed aside. It is a coordinated system built to absorb pressure without losing discipline. The closer the Venezuelan ships moved, the more they revealed about their training, their coordination, their confidence, and their limits. And the closer they came, the calmer the American response became. There were no dramatic messages sent over open channels, no public warnings. Standard bridge-to-bridge communications were transmitted in a professional tone, stating position, course, and the legal status of the transit. No response came back. That silence said plenty. By then, every sailor involved understood the weight of the moment. Not because a clash was inevitable, but because encounters like this are exactly where history can turn on a single mistake. One poor judgment call, one overreaction, one unnecessary step too far. That is how routine patrols become international incidents. So the carrier group did what it was trained to do. It kept moving. The sea still looked calm. The sky remained clear. But beneath that calm, something had changed. Venezuela had chosen to step into the path of one of the most disciplined naval formations in the world. From that moment forward, every second was being recorded. By 3:12 p.m., there was no longer any doubt about the pattern. The Venezuelan vessels had come close enough for their intentions to be measured, not guessed. Their speed changes were consistent. Their headings were deliberate. Instead of staying parallel or keeping a wide observation path, they angled inward, cutting across projected routes and shrinking the space between the formations. This was no ordinary presence at sea. On American displays, the closest point of approach kept decreasing. First 5 nautical miles, then 4, Each update brought a new calculation for the time remaining before the tracks would intersect. The numbers were clear. Unless something changed, the Venezuelan formation would pass directly ahead of the carrier group within minutes. Still, the American ships held their course. In naval operations, staying steady can be the strongest message of all. It shows confidence. It removes confusion. And most importantly, it denies the other side the reaction they may be trying to provoke. The Venezuelan vessels, meanwhile, kept pushing forward. Radio silence continued. There was no bridge-to-bridge coordination, no explanation, and no attempt to clarify their intentions. For experienced watch officers, that silence meant something. Professional ships do not stay quiet when distance begins to shrink. At close range, silence is not an accident. It is a decision. From Venezuela's point of view, the move had a purpose. They knew they could not match an American carrier group directly. That was never the real goal. The goal was pressure. Make the Americans adjust course. Create footage that could later be presented as defiance. Show people back home a navy standing firm in front of a global power. But the ocean does not reward theater. It rewards discipline. As the distance tightened, American escort ships made quiet internal adjustments. Nothing looked aggressive from the outside, but every movement was exact. Sensors changed priority. Surface search systems narrowed their focus. Optical equipment tracked hull numbers, deck activity, and crew movement. Everything happening aboard the Venezuelan ships was now visible, magnified, and preserved. Inside the operations center, every movement was logged. The atmosphere stayed controlled. No raised voices, no rushed orders, just a steady stream of information. Bearings, speeds, signals, course changes. Each Venezuelan ship was no longer just a dot on a screen. It had become a profile. And profiles reveal a lot. The data showed small signs of uncertainty, slight spacing problems, minor speed differences, small course corrections that suggested hesitation rather than confidence. This did not look like a carefully rehearsed maneuver by a navy used to operating near major naval formations. It looked like pressure being applied cautiously, with constant attention to how the Americans might respond. The carrier group did not change its behavior. Standard maritime messages were sent clearly and calmly. International waters, lawful transit, maintain safe distance. The language was professional, recorded, and impossible to misunderstand. There was still no reply. At 3:21 p.m., one Venezuelan ship moved ahead of the others, briefly increasing speed beyond the rest of the formation. It was a test. Would the Americans react? Would the carrier turn? Would the escorts make a visible move? They did not. That was the quiet moment when the balance began to shift. Pressure only works when the other side gives it something to use. With every passing minute, the Venezuelan vessels were burning fuel, revealing operating limits, sending out signals, and committing themselves deeper into a situation they did not control. The Americans, meanwhile, were collecting information without giving anything away. That is the advantage modern naval power is built on. You do not need a dramatic move to win the moment. Sometimes you only need to stay composed long enough for the other side to reveal itself. By 3:28 p.m., the geometry finally settled. The Venezuelan ships held their position just short of the intercept line, close enough to claim they were present, but not close enough to create an immediate crisis. It was a pause, but it was not a success. By then, the attempted block had already failed. The carrier group had not changed course. It had not slowed down. It had not given the Venezuelan formation the visible reaction it seemed to be looking for. Beyond standard procedure, the Americans offered nothing for Venezuela to turn into leverage. What remained was an uneasy standoff. One side steady and controlled, the other committed but unsure what to do next. And in moments like this, uncertainty can become the real danger. Once pressure stops working, there are only two choices left: push further or step back. Venezuela was quickly running out of space for either option. By 3:30 p.m., the encounter entered its most delicate stage. Not because anything dramatic was happening on the surface, but because the intentions were now clear. This is where less disciplined crews can make costly mistakes. The US Navy did not. Across the carrier group, the posture changed quietly. Not in a way meant to be seen from the outside, but inside the system itself. Monitoring shifted into focused prioritization. Sensor tasking became tighter. Data feeds were checked, compared, and synchronized. On the surface, everything still looked calm. Beneath the decks, however, a highly trained machine was doing exactly what it was built to do. Watch everything, record everything, reveal nothing. The carrier held its course and speed. The escort ships stayed in formation, their spacing intentional, their outlines unchanged. There was no sudden move that could be presented as intimidation, no visible step that could be twisted into a dramatic escalation. The message was restraint, but not hesitation. And that difference matters. Restraint without strength can look like weakness. Restraint backed by full awareness is control. As the Venezuelan vessels remained close to the intercept line, American sensors quietly took over the encounter. Surface search systems sharpened their focus. Optical equipment locked onto bridge wings, mast arrays, and deck movement. Electronic teams recorded signals, frequencies, power levels, and duration. Every sweep from the Venezuelan ships became another detail in a growing record. In modern naval operations, information is power, and the US Navy was gathering it piece by piece. At 3:34 p.m., an American helicopter lifted from the deck of one of the escort ships. The launch was smooth, calm, and clearly professional. There were no low passes, no sharp turns, no dramatic movements. Just a controlled climb and a steady approach toward the contact area. From the Venezuelan side, the meaning was obvious. There were now eyes above them. The helicopter kept a safe altitude and distance. Its presence was not aggressive, but it could not be ignored. And while the flight itself looked calm, its sensors were working constantly. Infrared systems tracked engine heat and wake patterns. High-definition optics captured movement on deck in real time. Every frame was location-marked and time-stamped. This was not a display. It was documentation. Standard warnings were transmitted again in a measured, precise tone. International waters, unsafe maneuvering, maintain distance. The voice on the radio stayed calm, professional, and final. The Venezuelan ships answered with no words, only hesitation. Their speeds shifted slightly. Course lines softened by a few degrees. Activity on deck slowed. These were small signs, but in close naval encounters, small signs can say a lot. Confidence stays steady, uncertainty drifts. The American formation did not change. No one rushed, no one overplayed the moment. The US Navy does not operate on emotion.
It operates on training, procedure, and discipline.
And that discipline says something simple. The longer you stay predictable, the more pressure moves to the other side. By now, the Venezuelan crews were facing an uncomfortable reality. They had gone far enough into the maneuver that pulling away could look like retreat, but moving closer risked crossing into a situation they could no longer manage. That is the danger of brinkmanship at sea. You move forward to create an effect. You pause and wait for a reaction. But when the reaction never comes, you're left exposed. Fuel burning, sensors active, crews tense, and leadership waiting for a moment that never arrives. Inside the American operations centers, there was no debate and no guesswork. Everything important was already being captured. The encounter was no longer about who could block whom. It was about who still had freedom of action. And the answer was already clear. At 3:42 p.m., the Venezuelan lead ship began to slow down gradually. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement, just a quiet easing away from the line it had been pushing toward only minutes earlier. The helicopter kept its orbit. The escorts held formation. The carrier stayed on course. There were no victory statements, no triumphant radio calls, no dramatic gestures, just professionalism doing its job. Because the most important moments at sea rarely look dramatic from the outside. To an untrained eye, they can look almost uneventful. But every sailor involved understood exactly what had happened. The attempted block had failed, not because it was directly challenged, but because it was calmly ignored. And in modern naval power, that can be the strongest answer of all. By 3:45 p.m., the outcome was clear. The Venezuelan maneuver had reached its limit, not because the US Navy forced it to stop, but because it stopped having any effect. That was where the mistake became obvious. A blocking maneuver only works if the other side reacts. The Venezuelan plan depended on pressure creating movement, a turn, a slowdown, a visible adjustment that could later be presented as success. But the carrier group gave them nothing. No course change, no hesitation, no dramatic response. And by refusing to react, the US Navy changed the entire balance of the encounter. From that moment on, every extra minute favored the Americans. Fuel use increased aboard the Venezuelan ships. Their formation became less precise. Their confidence began to look less certain. Small inconsistencies began to show. One vessel slipped slightly behind. Another moved a little too far ahead. These were not dramatic mistakes, but they mattered. Under steady pressure, even small details reveal how well a formation can coordinate, endure tension, and stay controlled. More importantly, the Venezuelan ships had already crossed the most costly line of the encounter. They had allowed themselves to be studied. Every radar sweep, every engine change, every movement on deck had been captured, organized, and preserved. What began as an attempt to create a strong political image had turned into a live demonstration of how Venezuelan naval forces behave under pressure. That kind of information does not simply vanish. It is reviewed, compared, and stored alongside earlier encounters. It helps analysts understand how a force moves, how it hesitates, how it reacts, and how it eventually steps back. This is where the strategic mistake became impossible to miss. Venezuela was not trying to overpower the carrier group, but by moving too close, they allowed themselves to be measured by a force built not only to deter, but to learn. The longer they stayed nearby, the more they revealed, while gaining nothing in return. The carrier group, meanwhile, gave up nothing. Its formation stayed intact. Its mission continued without interruption. Its crews followed procedure carefully, offering no dramatic footage, no visible reaction, and no moment that could be exaggerated later. From a legal and operational point of view, the American ships were exactly where they were allowed to be, doing exactly what they were permitted to do. And that is where brinkmanship begins to fail. When one side is performing and the other side is simply observing, the performer runs out of leverage first. At 3:51 p.m., the Venezuelan ships began to move outward. Not suddenly, not in a way that looked like a full withdrawal, but enough to break the shape of the attempted block. Speeds returned closer to normal. Courses widened. The intercept line faded quietly, almost awkwardly. There was no announcement, no explanation, no public acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened, but everyone involved understood what it meant. The maneuver had failed, not through a dramatic showdown, but through silence and discipline. That is the paradox of modern naval power. Sometimes the strongest response is the least visible one. It does not need to shout. It does not need to posture. It simply removes choices from the other side until only one remains. In this case, that choice was to ease away. The Venezuelan crews were left with footage of their ships approaching, lingering, and then drifting back. No American turn, no forced adjustment, no moment of clear success. Whatever message they hoped to create now had no powerful ending. The US Navy, on the other hand, left with something more useful than a headline. It left with clarity. Clarity about Venezuelan tactics. Clarity about command confidence. Clarity about how pressure was applied, how long it could be maintained, and how quickly it weakened when not backed by real capability. That was the true cost of the encounter. Future moments like this will not begin from zero. They will begin with everything learned here. Every movement Venezuela made during the attempted block will be remembered, not as a display of strength, but as a lesson in overreach. By the time the Caribbean returned to its quiet rhythm, the carrier group was already miles beyond the point of contact, still on course, mission intact. The Venezuelan ships remained behind, separated and silent, with little to show for the risk they had taken. And that is why this was a mistake. Not because Venezuela moved toward a carrier group, but because it did so without understanding what happens when pressure is applied to a force that does not need to react in order to prevail. By 4 p.m., the encounter was effectively finished. The Venezuelan vessels had fallen back far enough that the geometry no longer mattered. Distances opened, bearings stabilized. On American radar screens, what had moments earlier been a deliberate maneuver was now just background traffic, fading back into the normal pattern of the Caribbean Sea. The carrier group never slowed. From the carrier's deck, nothing appeared out of rhythm. Aircraft operations continued. Watch teams rotated on schedule. The massive ship moved forward through calm water, steady and almost indifferent to what had unfolded behind it. And for the US Navy, that was exactly the point. Success was not measured by overpowering the other side. It was measured by continuity. The mission never stopped. No course change was needed. No emergency posture was announced.
The carrier group continued exactly as planned, leaving behind an encounter that may not have looked dramatic from the outside, but made perfect sense to anyone who understood what had just happened. Because the real aftermath was not on the water, it was in the data. Every sensor log, every radar return, and every optical frame captured during the attempted block was already being gathered, compared, and studied. Not emotionally, not politically, professionally. Patterns were identified, maneuvering habits were mapped, reaction times were measured down to the second. This is how modern naval power builds its advantage, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. For Venezuela, the result was difficult to turn into a clean story. There was no footage of an American retreat, no dramatic standoff to broadcast, no clear moment that could be presented as success. What remained was silence, and in situations like this, silence is rarely neutral. It leaves questions open, it invites closer attention, it reveals intent without delivering the outcome that was expected. For the US Navy, the result was much simpler. Another transit completed, another encounter documented, another reminder that restraint, when backed by capability, is not weakness. It is control used quietly. And that lesson matters far beyond the Caribbean. Naval encounters do not exist in isolation. They become reference points. Each one shapes expectations for the next. Every action and every refusal to react becomes something future commanders, governments and crews remember. What Venezuela attempted that afternoon was not new. Smaller navies have often used proximity and pressure to test larger forces. Sometimes it creates a reaction. Sometimes it creates an image. Sometimes it gives the side applying pressure the exact moment it was looking for. This time it did not. Instead, it revealed a basic miscalculation. Power is not measured by how loudly a formation responds. It is measured by how little it needs to respond at all. The carrier group did not turn. It did not issue dramatic messages. It did not raise the temperature of the encounter. And by staying steady, it left Venezuela with only one practical option: ease away quietly, without acknowledgement. That kind of outcome sends a stronger message than any public statement. It tells future challengers that pressure without real leverage fades quickly. It shows that getting close without having the ability to shape the outcome often benefits the side that can afford to wait. And it proves that in moments like this, the most important turning point is not when a side makes a dramatic move, but when it realizes the other side never needed one. As the sun continued to sink over the Caribbean, the sea returned to the same calm appearance it had carried all afternoon. From a distance, it looked as if nothing had happened. But for the sailors who tracked the geometry,
the analysts reviewing the records, and the commanders weighing the meaning of the encounter, the lesson was clear. The US Navy did not prevail through force. It prevailed through discipline. And for Venezuela, that is the hardest kind of setback to explain.